Hi everybody, in this exercise we're going to be building a pyramid using nothing but text-based characters. Now the pyramid we're going to be building is not going to look like this. This is a little elaborate. Maybe in the future we can do an exercise where we do some sort of a tracing on an image and then replace various parts of the image with the appropriate characters so you get a nice 8-bit effect that you might have seen already on various websites. But no, what we're going to be creating is something a little bit more basic. Our goal is to, for a given level of depth that you specify, we'll be generating a pyramid that looks a little bit like this. Just a simple character, in this case a letter X, and then we just arrange the pyramid by arranging the X's in whatever arrangement needs to be so that it's perfectly centered as a triangle. So in this case, we can see that we have a depth of 5, we have one pyramid or one block of the pyramid at the very top, and they have 2 blocks in the next row, 3 blocks in the following row, and so on. And the goal is to have it be nicely centered. Now the one constraint is that we want it to be done in the console. Now the reason why I specify the console is that if you want to center something on the web, it's very easy to create a DOM element and just have it be text aligned centered. But just to add a little bit of extra creativity and complexity to what we're doing, we're going to use the console, where there is no easy way to center align things. We're not going to use HTML in the console, though we can. We're going to be figuring out how do we specify the spaces and make all the center of this completely happen. So the way I want to start about this first is whenever we see an example that looks like this, where we have to create something that is going to be one where the entire spatial arrangement, what we see and what we don't see, are all things we have to explicitly specify, I like to always break things down into a grid, a series of columns and a series of rows. So we take the example we just saw earlier and we break it down into that, you get something that looks like this. You see that for a pyramid of depth 5, we have to kind of have our X be in the middle. There are about 4 spaces, and then the second row, in this case row number 2, we have 2 X's, row number 3 we have 3 X's, and so on. So getting the rows and columns is the first step. But if we go one level deeper, this is a good visualization for us to kind of think of in terms of a grid. But in terms of how our code typically looks at things, everything we have dealt with so far, the index position of whether it's a string or it's an array, so it's 0. So let's go ahead and go one level beyond just having it arbitrarily be called rows and columns. Let's give each of them a number. So now you have our rows have numbers going 0 through 4, and our columns have number going from 0 through 8. Now what we're optimizing for is the depth of the pyramid. So we can kind of simplify things and say that what we really are focusing on is the vertical height, the depth, the 0 through 4 that we see here for the pyramid. And we can start to kind of formulate some patterns, because that's the next step here is that, okay, I'm at row 0, I see 1 X. I'm at row 1, I see 2 X's. And at row 2, I see 3 X's, and so on. The other thing also is that the amount of space that I tend to give everything is that we know our pyramid has a depth of 5, and for a pyramid depth 5, we have 4 X's here. 4 spaces before the X is on the 5th position, which would be index position 4. And then similarly in row 1, or depth of 1, we have, in this case, 3 spaces, and then 2 X's. That's an interesting way of kind of thinking about it, where we're like, okay, so the characters we're defining, there's a space there, and the reason there's a space here is that otherwise centering would be near impossible. Can you imagine trying to center X and like 2 characters when you have a grid of 3 by 3? It'll be odd to have X and an XX and a space. So the space is a critical part of giving us the centering. All right, and so if we had to simplify this approach, all the words and wild gestures of my hand, if I had to summarize it, it would be this. The number of X characters in each row is 1 more than the row number. For example, row 0 has 1 X character, row 1 has 2 X characters. We touched upon that in the previous slide. The number of leading spaces before the first X character appears is 1 less than the depth. At row 0 for a pyramid of depth 5, we have 4 space characters before the first X appears at column position 4. And similarly, we saw at row 1 for a pyramid of depth 5, we have 3 space characters before our first X appears. And there are 2 of them because we are on row 1. And so we had to break this apart even further and say, okay, we have 2 types of characters here. We have X's and we have O's. and we know the x's have a space to them as part of their natural operation. If that is the case, can we simplify the arrangement a bit, or the visualization a bit, so that way we can see the spaces more explicitly and the x's with their space more explicitly as well? And so when we look at it from that lens, you can see each of our leading spaces is represented by an O, a purple O, and each x is represented by an XO character. So they're both one character, or one string with two characters X and O in it, and the O is basically a space. And we'll remove that towards the end, but this kind of gives us an extra level of clarity on what we're trying to create. So once we have this going for us, right, we have the assumptions, we have the pattern that we sort of think we have a good grasp on, and now we have the plan to go from the words into the characters themselves, the spaces, and the X character, and then from there to write some code to make this all work. So let's go ahead and now turn everything we've seen into things that we can ultimately ship. What I have here is I have VS Code, and I had the exact same page open on the right hand side. So what I'm typing here, let me take this to hello world. If I refresh this page, you can see hello world appearing. And because we want to print things to the console, this is a good state for us to be in. You know, I have an app. What I'm specifying my console is now showing up on screen. So the first thing we do is that we know we're going to be printing essentially some items based on the depth of our pyramid. So let's go ahead and create a loop. So I'm going to do for let I equals 0, I equals less than depth, I plus plus, and then just do a console.log and just say hello again. And what I haven't done here, of course, is specify the value for depth. So I'm going to do let depth equals 5. So we know that when we refresh it, we'll see the word hello printed 5 times. Now, what we want to do though is we know that we want to specify some space characters and some X characters, which we defined earlier as X equals X0 as a space, and then let space equals just O. So this way we have that differentiation between what is an X and what is a space. And if we want to print out something on a screen now, I can just do this, do space, and just see if everything looks good. Yep, 5 O's are printing to the screen. One of the things we talked about earlier is that the amount of space characters in each row is essentially the depth minus the minus 1, essentially, where you have character space and then you have an X. And so we had to specify that as part of our design. Let's go ahead and think about how that would look. We know that we want to repeat space, so the handy method we have on the string is the repeat method. So I'm going to do console.log space.repeat, and what repeat does, I'll specify a number, and this number specifies how many times we will be currently printing a value to the screen. So if I just do value of I, which is our loop itself, you can now see we have 0 spaces all the way up to 4 spaces, which is pretty convenient, exactly what we want. Just kidding, that's not what we want. What we want to do is actually do the opposite. We want to have more spaces at the top, and then as we get towards the bottom, no spaces at all. And that's where the depth value comes in again. So I'm going to space.repeat depth minus I. Let's refresh the page now, and you can now see we have 5 spaces, 4, 3, 2, and 0. Now, when we talked about it earlier, we knew that the number of spaces, though, is not exactly all 5. It's actually not depth. It's actually the less than the value of depth, because the X, the first X, will be showing up at the very end. So let's offset that by 1, just so we are on the same page. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And the last line is just going to be all X's, which is perfect. So now we have the space part of a pyramid sort of figured out. And now it's time to think about, okay, where will the X's themselves actually go? And so I'm going to simplify things a bit here. I'm going to create a variable called leading spaces. Let leading spaces equals, and I'm going to put all of this value inside of it. And the next one I'm going to do is let X characters. And it's going to be the X character dot repeat, and it's going to be I plus 1. We know that, for example, at row 0, which would be I equals 0, that was 1 character. At row 1, we had 2 characters, and so on. So we'll start it in this approach. And now let's do a console.log of what would be leading spaces plus X characters. Let's print this out to the screen. And once you've done that, notice what you see here. You see 4 spaces X, 2 X's, 3 X's in row 3, and you can sort of see our pyramid is mostly balanced. It is working. It looks kind of nice. Now, all that really remains though is for us to now, remember we talked about how X is not really X0, it's just there for X. O, it's just for us to make sense of what's going on. Let me replace the O with the space itself. So I didn't delete the O, I just replaced it with a space character. So it's an empty space. And now if I refresh it, you can now see X. All the X's are properly making up the pyramid. It looks more like a Christmas tree actually, but that's okay. You know, we don't want to deal with that, you know, neither here nor there right now in how we deal with that right now, but it looks like a pyramid. And the nice thing is that if I change it to, let's say, depth of 2, we have a much smaller pyramid. If I set it to a depth of 25, we see a much larger pyramid. I have to zoom out actually so you can see all of it. Just for kicks, let me put 100 and refresh the page. Okay, yeah, that's a lot of X's. Can I zoom out all the way? Oh yeah, I can zoom out way back and you can see how this all looks, but you can go creative and you can go as large as you want, and our code is pretty resilient. So if I put like a -5, you'll see that nothing really happens because we're using the repeat method and also the loop. None of this actually kicks in, so our edge cases are pretty decently defined. So we're in a good spot there. And so, you know, if we had to look back at this again, there isn't a whole lot beyond what we described. The hard part really was how do we translate an open-ended problem like build a pyramid out of text characters into smaller and smaller subproblems that we can rationalize as things we can do in code. And one way for this problem was just think of things in terms of a grid of rows and columns, which simplified a lot of our thinking. And then going one level extra on the abstraction train, where we replaced each character for X with an X and an O to make the space more visualizable, and then each leading space with an O itself. So as we were debugging it and building it, if there were any issues, we were able to count and visualize how to go ahead and solve it. So if you have any questions, post in the forums at phonetcrypt.com, where I and others will be happy to help you out. Sign up to my newsletter where I talk about all kinds of things related to design, development, business, and all the fun things that we probably deal with on a day-to-day basis. And lastly, follow me on Twitter, where you'll get bite-sized updates on topics like this and other web development things that I'm fiddling with. And if you like my way of explaining things visually in a casual, friendly way, you might absolutely like my books that all cover similar topics. A key to this one would be the JavaScript book of the Beginner's Guide, where everything we looked at here were topics that are covered in friendly but great depth in that book. And of course, there are other books I've written on front-end topics, link in the description below in both paperback and Kindle digital editions. So you can use the physical version of it or use the digital version, whatever floats your boat. And with that, I will see you all next time.